There's a whole lot you're not hearing about what's going on in Venezuela. We're going to talk about it on today's Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hey folks, Chuck Holton here. I'm still at my daughter's apartment and we're kind of getting the whole family together and trying to make it down to the lodge in West Virginia. But it's a beautiful day, and so I'm working outside here. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in Venezuela, because with all of the chaos and craziness that's happening around the country and even around the world because of the riots and all of that, there's a lot of stuff that's just not making the news that you probably want to know about, especially when it comes to Venezuela. Now, before all this started, there was well, let's just back up a little bit. Venezuela has been trying to make better friends with Iran because really the government of Maduro, his survival depends on it. They've got to get to be better friends with Iran because they need Iran's resources. And Iran, being under U.S. sanctions, just like Venezuela, is very glad to share its resources with Venezuela because Iran wants a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And so it's a match made in heaven for these two evil regimes that are really not making life easy for their people by holding on to power. Now, take Maduro, for example. He's got so many sanctions against his country, and the price of oil is so low that the government of Venezuela is basically not making any money at all. They basically lost their job when it comes to revenues in that country. And that's really bad for a socialist country, because how are they supposed to keep up with all of these massive social programs that they've committed to? That is what garnered them votes when they literally don't have any money to spend. So they've been working very hard on illicit ways to make money so that they can buy what they need. Most of all, just fuel. Now, this is, as you know, Venezuela is one of the countries with the largest reserves of oil on the planet. And they used to be a net exporter of fuel for many, many years. And they worked very hard to use their fuel reserves as a way to influence the politics of their neighbors. So they gave heavily subsidized fuel to Haiti, to Nicaragua, to many countries around the Caribbean and in Central and South America, and did that with strings attached. And so when they were unable to do that anymore, and they had to stop giving that heavily subsidized fuel to all those countries, it caused massive unrest over the last couple of years in those countries. So a lot of the unrest we've seen in Haiti, in Nicaragua, has come from the fact that now the people there were used to getting very cheap gasoline, and now they can't. Well, that same thing has happened in Venezuela. You know, in Venezuela, gasoline was so plentiful that it was essentially free. And you could pull up to a gas pump, you could fill your tank for literally pennies and be on your way. Well, now it's gotten to the point where there just has been no gasoline for a long time. We've reported on this over the last couple of years. That gasoline has been being stolen from Venezuela and smuggled out of the country into Colombia and sold for a profit. That was one of the ways that Venezuelans were just trying to survive. Well, there's not even any gasoline to smuggle anymore. It's gone. They're just out of fuel. And so massive lines at the gas stations, no fuel, and a lot of hardship and economic misery because of that. So Venezuela right now is the picture of a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. Think about that. They have the crisis of the COVID virus happening, inside the crisis of a fuel shortage happening, inside of a crisis of mammoth proportions of hyperinflation, socialism, and dictatorship. This is not a good place to live right now. So the great idea that Venezuela got was to start purchasing gasoline from Iran. And the problem with that is that Venezuela doesn't really have any money either. And so how do they get money? Well, the government of Venezuela has been working very hard to foster the smuggling of drugs throughout the Western Hemisphere and to Europe, cocaine especially, smuggling it from Colombia through Venezuela and transporting it around the world from there. And so the United States, the Drug Enforcement Administration, has put sanctions on a lot of Venezuelan politicians and powerful people, military generals and that sort of thing, put them on their wanted lists because of this smuggling that they are helping to foster. Now, they are just now putting sanctions on the first lady of Venezuela, Maduro's wife, because of she's been a real bigwig in this global drug smuggling consortium, and so they're making it even more difficult. So Venezuela has been trying to make money from the drug trade, and that's getting harder and harder to do. They're trying to make money. They're trying to repatriate a lot of the assets that have been frozen around the world. Venezuela used to be a very modern first world country, and they had lots and lots of money that they stashed all over the world, in Switzerland, in Europe, in the UK. They had gold, tons of it, that they stored around the world. And as this dictatorship got worse and worse, those sanctions, one of the things they did was they froze those assets. Now, the Maduro regime has been going to court in the UK to try to get something like 8 tons of gold released from there, and allowed, I think it's 8 tons of gold, released and given back to the government of Venezuela in order to finance this importation of gasoline from Iran. Now, it's said that they have already paid Iran something like, they've been paying Iran in gold, and they've paid them something like 8 tons of gold already. And that runs today's prices about $400 million that they've done in the gold that they had in the country, and they are extracting a lot of gold illegally out of the Amazon. So what I've actually reported on before out of Colombia, called blood gold, is being sold by Venezuela to finance their efforts to keep their country running. Now, they have taken the EU to court on these sanctions, and they're trying to get these assets released to them so that they can use them. So they're trying to get the EU to release the gold that's in its possession that belongs to Venezuela and give it to the Maduro regime. But if you remember, most of the EU countries and the United States and about 60 countries around the globe have actually recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela and not Nicolas Maduro. So now Juan Guaido is going to Europe and saying, wait a minute, you can't give this gold to the Maduro regime because I'm the legitimate president of Venezuela, and so you've got to give it to my people. Well, that looks like it's likely to happen. That if the gold gets released at all, it will most likely get given to the Guaido regime, but it's got to work its way through the courts, and that's going to take some time. Suffice it to say that Juan Guaido basically told the EU that if you release this gold to the Maduro regime, you will be financing terror and torture inside Venezuela. Now, let's talk about the COVID crisis. We did tons of reporting last year on the literally millions of Venezuelans who were leaving Venezuela and making their way to other countries in Central and South America just to try to survive. Many of them walking for days to get out of Venezuela, cross the border into Colombia, and walking for weeks to get all the way to the border of Ecuador, go all the way to Chile, and all over the place. Now, the road that these migrants have to travel as they make their way to Bogota is fraught with risk. You can see the truck traffic and just how narrow it is, especially as they get into the mountains. But the bigger risk is the cold. When they get up here, it's actually really chilly. And if you're sleeping on the ground with just the clothes on your back, you can imagine that the risk of hypothermia would be very real. That's why this woman that lives in this house opened her home to up to 100 migrants a night. She just lets them come in and sleep on the floor for free. And she's also gotten some extra help to feed them and give them what they need. Now, because of the COVID crisis and because all of these countries are shutting down, many of these Venezuelan refugees no longer have any jobs or income. They're being kicked out of their apartments and they're being left out on the street. So many of them, tens of thousands of them anyway, are moving back to Venezuela where at least they have some family and may be able to get some food to eat. So um, even though things are all that bad in Venezuela, there's nothing really good to go home to. These guys are making their way, some of them on foot, back to their home country, hoping to be able to survive. Now, what I'm hearing from those who make it back to Venezuela is that it's gotten far worse even since we left, and we had no idea it was this bad in Venezuela now, and we probably wouldn't have come back if we knew how bad it actually was. Suffice it to say that when they get back, they're being forced to quarantine for several weeks in camps, for lack of a better term. These camps are tremendously Spartan, no water, no running water, no electricity. There's virtually no chance for social distancing, and it's not a good place if you are coming down with the COVID virus to be. But they don't have any choice. They're being stuck there. The food is terrible. There's no medical care, and so things are just continually ramping up for the Venezuelan people, getting worse and worse and worse. So what does Venezuela do? They're buying gasoline from Iran. Iran has been putting it on tankers and shipping it across to Venezuela. The United States has been grumbling about that fact and actually threatening possible military action against those tankers. Iran basically called our bluff on that and said, we're sending all these tankers. You want to blow them up, we're going to have a big problem. And we didn't do anything about the first, I think, 8 tankers that showed up last week. This gasoline is now being sold at a premium inside Venezuela. So the Venezuelans who are used to getting gas for free are now having to spend a lot of money to get gasoline. That obviously means that only the people who are close to the leadership in the government, who are favored by the government, are going to be able to get gasoline at all. So that's not going to help them a whole lot. They need a whole lot more gasoline. And Iran is very happy to provide it because it gives Iran a chance to have a regular shipping corridor coming across to Venezuela, whereby they might be able to ship other things to the Western Hemisphere that would help them in their quest against the United States of America. Think terrorist material like bombs and explosives and who knows what that could be smuggled across. Iran is a very adept smuggling country. They're very good at smuggling because they've been under sanctions like Venezuela has for many, many years, and they've gotten very, very good at smuggling. And so the concern is that they will cross-pollinate with the Venezuelans, give the Venezuelans some of their smuggling technology, some of their smuggling know-how that will assist the Venezuelans in smuggling more drugs to the United States and perhaps terrorists and terrorist material. That's not a good thing. What that means is that the U.S. military is either going to have to start blowing Iranian tanker ships out of the water, which is not likely, or they're going to have to ramp up our interdiction efforts in the Caribbean between Venezuela and the United States to stop things like unmanned semi-submersible ships that could take 8 tons of cocaine or explosives or who knows what underwater to the U.S. border or to the U.S. coast. Those things are very real possibilities. Iran already has unmanned submersibles, basically drone submarines that it can that could potentially be used for criminal enterprises if they were to share that technology or the drones themselves, the subs themselves, with Venezuela. So that's obviously not a good thing. Anyway, a lot to think about. And there's a whole lot more. I can't even, don't even have time to get into this failed Operation Gideon, where some well-meaning but poorly led, funded and trained uh, patriots, I guess you'd call them, tried to invade Venezuela a couple of weeks ago and were all either captured or killed. That has not turned out very well at all. It's turned out to be something like a really bad Saturday Night Live skit at this point. We could talk about that some more. Just don't have time today. But that's all we've got for the podcast right now. If you have questions, if you'd like to see me cover certain things, go ahead and send me a message. You can get a hold of me on Patreon at patreon.com/hotzone. You can get a hold of me at Facebook at the Hot Zone Hot Zone page. And I'm happy to answer your questions. If you'd like to see a podcast about a certain thing, let me know and we'll do it. All right. I'll be back at my place in West Virginia before too long. And we've got a lot more content for you. Thanks for watching.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.